being run by Onward, I have had the privilege of co-chairing some research that Onward have been doing about how we get to net zero and what the practicalities are and how industries will be affected. But the focus of today's webinar is about the role of environmental, social, and governance issues on sustainable finance for the future. And we've got some really excellent contributors this morning who will illuminate this important subject. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say, because when I was Secretary of State for the Environment, I was in Rio when we were negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a British aspiration then that we should help move the global economy to sustainable finance by encouraging companies to report their sustainability. But it's one thing for politicians to wish those kind of things into global statements. It's another thing to make this happen in reality. And a sharp focus has been shone on that by the need to get to net zero by our target dates, and even more acutely perhaps by the global pandemic that we've all faced, which has put so much pressure on the environment. But today we're going to be hearing from our 4 speakers on the subject. One of them, my former colleague, Harriet Baldwin, the Member of Parliament for West Worcestershire. Harriet was a Treasury Minister and a Minister at the Department for International Development, and before coming into politics, she was in investment banking, so a very good skill set with which to approach this subject. We're then going to hear from Ben Caldicott. So Ben was a founding director of Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme at the Smith School. And really Ben sits at that interface between academia, policy, and the practice that the whole economy has to try and follow. We're looking forward to hearing from him. And then we're going to be hearing from someone representing one of what Onward would call the incumbent industries. So one of the key industries in the energy sector that has to make a huge transition if we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So Alan Hayward, Senior Vice President at BP, is going to be talking to us. And then I'm going to come back to the Minister, also a former colleague of mine, Guy Opperman. So Guy is now a Minister in the Department of Work and Pensions, and he will give us that government perspective on this. But I think it's also significant that Guy spent 20 years as director of his family's engineering business. And so, you know, we'll be thinking in the context of all of this, not just of the big BPs of this world, but also what this is all going to mean, sustainable finance for small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's our lineup today. And without more ado, I'm going to come to Harriet. Each of our speakers will have 5 minutes to make their opening remarks before we move to our discussion and questions, so keep them coming. So Harriet, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dame Caroline, and it's lovely to see everybody. And I am going to speak from the perspective of being a member of the Treasury Select Committee, which is a cross-party group of MPs that scrutinises all of this. And we recently published a report in terms of the decarbonisation of finance. And I think what I would start with saying is I think this agenda is so important that it does need to be one which is supported across party, and therefore our report really focused on the area of common ground in terms of the members of the committee. And we highlighted the fact that the Treasury is doing a great deal in this area, as are the regulators. And the COP26 this year is obviously a great opportunity on which to hang even more of an advance in this area. And specifically, there is talk about the taxonomy announcement in terms of green finance. This is not about species classification, it's about the classification of the different types of financial instruments and activities which they might fund. And I think the UK is planning to publish its taxonomy in time for COP26, which we would anticipate to go even further than the one that the EU is working on. We think there is scope to continue to widen disclosures. We think there's scope to be consistent and rapid in terms of the implementation of the regulatory framework. We think the regulators can widen their remits to include more of this. And we came up with some specific concrete examples, for example, for the FCA, if anyone is watching from there, a green fintech challenge, which really helps tackle some of the regulatory barriers that green innovation can face. Something in terms of making sure that the indices against which so many of our pensions are managed disclose more in terms of their carbon footprint. And we did include a recommendation, which may come up on the Q&A, to consider mandatory carbon labelling. And that certainly we think is likely to be the direction of travel. We're very concerned that the FCA is rigorous in terms of recording the appropriate levels of green finance, so that it's not seen as greenwashing. We think that would be very, very serious in terms of undermining progress in this area. And we think the Treasury itself, with the UK Infrastructure Bank, regulators with the review of Solvency II, the establishment of the Long-Term Asset Fund, and the publication of the Net Zero Strategy, and then the ongoing work for the Net Zero Review and the work across all departments in terms of their impact. All of those provide opportunities for the Treasury to signal a very strong direction of travel in this important area, and one where we think on the Treasury Select Committee that the UK can certainly provide a leadership role in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. And you've given us a really good tour around the challenges. And we'd expect someone on the Select Committee to have that oversight of the range of measures that you're considering. So thank you very much for that. No doubt we'll come on to all of that in more detail. So I'm going to now ask Ben if he'd like to make his remarks, bringing that kind of independence from academia. Ben.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dame Caroline, for that kind introduction, and wonderful to join this event this morning. So what I want to talk about is how we finance the transformation of the global economy that's already underway. And of course, this is a requirement of achieving net zero, tackling climate change, but is also inevitable. It's happening. Pick a sector of the global economy and you can see the transformations underway. And it's the most capital intensive transition in human history. We're moving from systems that have traditionally been dependent on operational expenditure. You build the gas-fired power station and you pay the main cost over the lifetime of that asset is the fossil fuels that you buy to combust in that asset, to one that's based on capex. Most of the investment is upfront, most of the cost is upfront. You build the wind farms, and then the marginal costs, the running costs, are very low because, of course, the wind blows for free. And this transition requires massive new investments in infrastructure, capital equipment, of course, but we also need to create new IP, new business models, new brands, new organizational capabilities, and of course, workers as well need to invest in learning new skills. And finance and investment have this really important role to play in providing capital efficiently and cheaply to support that transition, as well as providing the financial products and services to support clients in their own varied transitions, whether they're companies, big companies, smaller companies, whether they're government, central government, local government, or indeed as individuals. And given the scale, the complexity, and the duration of the net zero transition, and this inevitable ongoing transition from OPEX systems to CAPEX systems, we're going to need a range of different financial products and services at different times to support entities to move. And we call that transition finance, which is the provision and use of financial products and services to support counterparties like companies, governments, individuals to realize alignment with environmental and social sustainability. And I think this idea of transition finance needs to be at the center of how the UK thinks about sustainability and sustainable finance and the future of financial services. We have a huge market opportunity here to create the products and services able to transition the global economy to net zero. You could argue we also have a responsibility to do that. I think one of the most exciting areas of this is what's called sustainability linked bonds and sustainability linked loans. And essentially what these do is they change your cost of capital based on whether you meet, fail to meet, or exceed predefined sustainability KPIs. And these are starting to get traction in the market. They create a real financial and economic incentive for counterparties to become more sustainable. And we need to become the global center of structuring and issuing these types of instrument. They're a really important part of the future of sustainable finance. But it's not just going to be about those sorts of instruments. We're going to see different packages of financial products and services emerge that will encompass all sorts of things: smart contracts, new prediction markets. There'll be new forms of public and private partnership. These are going to have to be designed, tailored to sectors, to geographies. A huge number of different solutions are going to be designed and deployed, which is going to be a huge draw of demand for the expertise that we see in the City of London. And so you should view transition finance as a much broader set of financial products and services and a real big market opportunity. Now, what should we be doing to try and promote transition finance? So a number of things. One is around data. We need to understand how counterparties, how clients are performing. Where are they starting from? How are they changing? Are they improving? Are they not? And that's really important for underpinning the success of these instruments and these new market opportunities. Disclosure is certainly part of that story. There's also really important work, for example, that we're leading as part of something called the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment that's been set up by UK Research and Innovation, where we're using new data sets and novel methods, machine learning, for example, on Earth observation data, to transform the availability of this kind of information to really empower financial institutions to see what's going on. We need to think more about vehicles and how we support the creation of new investment vehicles. What structures can we use to get capital to flow in the right direction? And also, relatedly, kind of tax incentives that might be associated with new vehicles and new structures. Should we be using the super deductions, for example, that were announced in the last budget and tie them in some way to net zero, or in some way to ambitious emissions reductions, for example? Do we need to think about the listings review that happened recently and how we might be able to create new investment vehicles specifically to support the transition of companies in the UK? And can we be a global centre for raising capital for that purpose? I think all of that's really exciting, really important. We also need to create demand. One way we can do that is by making all public finance above a certain level sustainability linked, to create the demand for these instruments. And then we can also create demand for these instruments and for these products and services by encouraging companies to have transition plans. And that's a way of creating demand. So I think this is at the very center stage of what we need to do for the future of UK financial services. It's really mission critical for delivering net zero. And hopefully government and regulators will take that on board. So I'll stop there, Caroline.
Ben, that's really excellent. And in your remarks, really, you are addressing one of the key questions we're trying to get at today, which is how you mobilize private finance to get us to net zero. I was particularly encouraged to hear you mention the importance of data and transparency and disclosure, because, you know, back in that statement at Rio Plus 20, I think what inspired us to really press for that commitment globally to move to sustainable finance is also that need for investors to know whether they are investing in companies that are genuinely sustainable. And for that, disclosure and data are both required. So I'm very glad you touched on that. Well, we've talked there a lot about mobilizing private finance, and now I'm going to come to Alan. And the energy sector has already had to mobilize a lot of finance on its transitional path to net zero. So Alan, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Dame Caroline. And yes, very happy to be here. And I think you're right. You know, now is absolutely the time that we need to be thinking about how we manage this energy transition. You know, and the detail is key. And this idea of funding and the narrative of greening, really important. So I'll echo a few of the things which Harriet and Ben have talked about. Three things I'd like to cover. I mean, the first is a little bit about the transformation which BP is undertaking in support of net zero by 2050 or sooner. The second is the role of greening, and interesting that that word has been used a few times, of greening companies and the need to support them. And then lastly, how policy is a key part of that success. So as people may know, BP is a company in transition, We set out last year an ambition to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world to get to net zero. And we believe that we have a strategy which diversifies the company and decarbonizes the company in a way which will deliver the ambition, grow a sustainable long-term value proposition for stakeholders, and maintain competitive returns for our investors. We have to get the balance here. Now, 3 key aims that we have for 2030, just to illustrate the nature of the transition, are a 10-fold increase in our investment in renewables by 2030 to $5 billion a year, a near doubling in the value of our convenience and mobility business, including a massive ramp up in electric vehicle charging networks, and a 40% reduction in our oil and gas production, whereby we will optimize efficiency and drive down emissions. And I think people are clear, but just to restate, why the change? Well, the world's carbon budget is finite and is running out. Society, including our employees, and they're very important in this, society wants us and needs us to change, and there is an enormous business opportunity. So the second point that I would make is about greening companies, and we're moving fast, but this is a process and not an overnight switch. I think it was Mark Carney who said that to reach the Paris goals, we need to go where the emissions are. And that means looking at industries, generally the sort of the emissions intense industries or transport or our sector of energy. And therefore we see ourselves as part of the solution with the scale and the capability to make a significant contribution to a world which is in pursuit of reductions in global emissions. Now we probably need to define a greening company, but I would say for starters, it's one which is committed to net zero, has plans and targets to get there, and they need to be economically feasible, and is transparent, to echo that point about data and disclosure, is transparent in setting out milestones and transparent in reporting progress against those milestones. Now for BP, we've laid out targets and aims across all the scopes of emissions, across time frames. We're now very much focused on execution. And that takes me to the third point, which is if we are to play the fullest part in this transition, then we need support. And that support comes in the form of policy, which we're talking about, and investment, which Ben was talking about. And if I look at financing specifically, then I think there is a risk, and Harriet talked about the taxonomy in the EU, there is a risk that people take a binary view that green is good and anything else is not. Whereas I think policy needs to incentivize investment, recognize the role of this greening company. Ideally, I would say support an economy-wide price on carbon and be clear in its support for low as well as zero carbon technologies. And that hopefully will enable a regulatory regime which is clear and consistent and objective. And I think there is something about being more standardized, because there's a plethora of initiatives at the moment. And in the pursuit perhaps of transparency, there's a risk that almost can't see the wood for the trees. And therefore that just takes me to the point about, can we learn from the EU taxonomy, which Harriet was talking about, and the way it talks about sustainable finance. And what I would say in conclusion is, I think the EU taxonomy and the Sustainable Finance Initiative has received quite a lot of challenge from member states. And there are things which the UK can learn from that. In pursuit of a zero carbon objective, which we all fully support, I think the EU has tended to promote a quite exclusive definition of sustainable, and the pushback has been on the trajectory and the content of the transition. Ben talked about transition financing, green financing. So I think the best way for the UK is to, frankly, ensure that there is a dialogue, and that dialogue is inclusive of all stakeholders, because it does take all of us to complete this transformation. And in a way that brings me back full circle to just thank you for including us in this dialogue today. Thank you, Dame Caroline.
Thank you very much, Alan. And we're going to come to our last set of remarks, and we hope, Guy, you aren't feeling too much pressure. The clock is ticking towards COP26, less than 6 months to go. And the UK government and its policy and its strategy towards net zero is going to come under a lot of scrutiny in the run up to that. But I think you're in a position to make a good stab at answering one of our key questions, which is what role the government can play in regulating financial services to be more focused on environmental, social, and governance issues. I think it's really important. Alan just said it isn't just about greening. ESG is three-dimensional. And certainly the work that the research that Onward has been doing has been really quite granular in getting down to the detail of what the social as well as the environmental impact is, constituency by constituency in the UK. But anyway, Guy, we're looking very much forward to what you have to say.
So thank you to Onward, thank you to Caroline. I think you should frame this with the UK being the first country to legislate in the G7 to go net zero by 2050. And that's the start of that framework. And the end point is the COP summit in November. And look at what has happened in between. And as the minister who took forward the ESG regulations and introduced them into the House of Commons and brought them into law, I've got a unique ability to, I believe, assist this particular debate. And you're right that the focus has been largely on the environmental elements of ESG. Governance is something that I think everybody is taking due account of on an ongoing basis, but there's still more work to be done. But on the social element, you may have missed, amidst the plethora of things that we all do, that there is a call for evidence by the DWP at the present stage as to how it is individual pension schemes and more particularly the wider economy looks at the social element of ESG and how it is that that investment policy can be reflected. So that closes on the 16th of June. I would ask anybody who's interested in that element of it, please, to respond. Within the confines of the net zero announcement and the and COP, I think there are a number of key things that I can talk to you about. And you ask about data. Well, the UK has I'm very proud to say that we are the first country in the world to have introduced TCFD in law. Now, there is no country who is ahead of us in this particular element. And TCFD, for those who don't know, stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It is utterly key. When I sat down with Mark Carney about 14 months ago and discussed with him and said, what is the one single thing that you would ask the UK government to do to drive forward real change leading up to COP? And he said TCFD. So I'm delighted that the Pension Schemes Act that Harriet and I voted into law in the January of this year does genuinely bring TCFD into law. It provides the consumer and the individual with the granular data on actual investments, and it provides great ability to hold individual pension schemes to account. And why does this matter? Because it doesn't matter whether you're BP or an individual investor. You are going to need finance to drive forward the change that all of us want to see. And there are only three ways you get this finance. Either it comes from government taxes, either it comes from private sector investment, or it comes through individual investment, whether that's through stocks and shares or pension scheme investment, of which pension schemes are by far the largest. And our work on ESG has meant that clearly climate change is now a material part of investment by pension schemes. And it has made that absolutely intrinsic. But there are also specific investment opportunities for pension schemes that we have driven forward. Let me give you a couple of quick and easy examples. There is the Green Gilt. We have driven forward a desire from large numbers of pension schemes to invest in a ESG compliant, safe and reliable investment backed by government, much as the French and Germans and other countries have done. And so last November, the Chancellor announced the Green Gilt, details to be forthcoming, which genuinely will provide an opportunity for pension schemes to invest in exactly the sort of things we're looking for. We're also working on the long-term asset fund, on super funds, on capability for better stewardship. I'm certainly leading a proper review of stewardship of companies, from big companies to smaller companies, of how it is you drive forward ESG investing by those companies. And that dovetails particularly on voting and actual action rather than just the sort of standard engagement that has been going on in the past. So there's a couple of things I want to finish on, which I'll do briefly, which is the first is For anybody here who thinks that divestment is the way ahead, they should just leave straight away, because that is absolutely not the right way forward. What we need to do is we need to work with all the companies who are evolving into clean energy, into renewable companies who are actually going to come up with the solutions, because government is not going to solve this. We're not going to invent new nuclear. We're not going to invent carbon capture. We're going to need business to do that. So we have to work with business, and anybody who says divestment is the way ahead is frankly utterly misguided. The second key point for me would be that we need to have a proper partnership between government setting policy. I think we're doing that in terms of ESG as a framework, in terms of TCFD as a granular specific data requirement. And then we need products, and those products include things like the Green Gilt, long-term asset funds, and abilities for people to invest in a way that takes things forward. Clearly, there is work to do in terms of EU taxonomy, British approaches, trying to harmonize the way in which various people report and then actually invest as a result of that. But that, to be honest, is a work in progress, and it'd be naive to suggest anything else. But from my view, my glass is very definitely half full. We are on a journey. And the thing I'm proudest about is whatever the merits or otherwise of the UK in the world today, on the issue of ESG and sustainable investing, we lead the world. And we lead the world in an opportunity as well, which is a win-win. We've got to do this for ourselves, quite clearly, for reasons that we all understand on this call. But we also need to do this because we want to create a city of London and businesses in this country that are actually the focus point for future investment. So that we're saying to the rest of the world, if you're actually interested in green finance, if you're interested in long-term renewable investment, and you want the products and the people who are actually going to guide you there, come to London. And that, in a post-Brexit world, is utterly key.
Well, thank you very much, Guy. And that's music to my ears, because that really was the vision that Britain had at Rio Plus 20 for the City of London, our stock market, to be seen as a safe and green place for investors to go. And as you say, we're on a journey, but that's very encouraging. And when it comes to COP26 in November, no doubt you will be showcasing that to the wider world as well. We've got some quite interesting questions coming in now, and I'm going to throw these open to the panel. And if panelists feel free to chip in, probably shorter answers at this stage, so we can get through more of the questions. So the first question I've got here is how private finance can be mobilized to invest in novel technologies that will help us to get to net zero emissions, like CCUs. So who might like to chip in about that? Private finance for novel technology. Anyone like to venture?
Why don't I go first?
Okay,
so, I mean, the first thing is that when the term private finance, there's nothing to stop an individual investing in stocks and shares in a particular company that is attempting to do carbon capture or anything else. But the key, I suggest, is in terms of asset managers and pension scheme trustees who are doing that investment. Now, there's no question we should encourage that. You need proper data reporting, so you need a proper understanding of what that company is trying to do. To be fair, we're doing that. That's what ESG and TCFD do. What we shouldn't be doing is divesting. I saw one of the questions raised is that's complete idiocy. There's no way that is the right way forward. What we should be doing is working with the companies who are going to come up with carbon capture and storage. We need to be investing in those companies and then having proper stewardship and proper guidance as to how it is that they are going on that journey. So there is perfect opportunity for individuals to so invest, but the heavyweight investment by asset managers and by pension scheme trustees needs to be done in the right way going forward. And to be fair, you need proper understanding of what a long-term green investment looks like. And that's what we're providing on an ongoing basis. So slightly, I think the work is being done. It's a journey, obviously, but at the same stage, there are opportunities aplenty.
Harriet, did you want to come in?
Might I add, Dame Caroline, that I think that one of the recommendations we came up with was for the FCA to create a green fintech challenge. I think we don't know all the answers. Definitely, policymakers aren't going to be able to come up with them all. And I think it's really important that the private sector has an incentive, and this would be one way to really send out that message to the world that we're looking for the solutions to come in the fintech sector as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that point.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Well, maybe we shall move on to another question. I've got one here from Sophie Fitton. So Sophie is asking whether members of the panel would have a view about companies like Anglo, Rio Tinto and BHP and how they're doing on their transition pathway to net zero. Anybody like to venture into that territory? Definitely fall into the no takers for that subject.
I'll come in.
I'm happy to, yeah.
I'm happy to come in, Caroline. So, I mean, listen, the individual companies have to engage on an individual journey, all right? So the idea they're going to fix it day one is naive and wrong. But clearly, between day one and 2050, there has to be a clear pathway, a clear journey that they're on. They've got to show real signs. They've got to engage with their investors, which are the large heavyweight pension schemes and investment managers. And they've got to show, BP as an example. It's no different from Anglo or BHP or any of these other companies as to, right, you say you're heading in this direction, show us by thoughts, word and deed that that's what you are doing. And there is no question that there needs to be better partnership with pension schemes to do some of this investment, but clearly they're on a journey. They've got to show that. Anybody though who says, oh, you have to have a mandatory net zero by this particular year, A, doesn't understand business, and B, will force divestment. And both of those things would be very bad in my view.
Yeah, I think it's very fair. I don't think it's no good having a whipping boy in all of this. The work that Onward has done, researching incumbent industries which are affected by our commitment to get to net zero. There are whole categories of industry that have got a very difficult journey ahead of them. Agriculture is one, the steel industry is another. So I think, it's not going to help us to single out individual companies that, but I think that's recognizing what a challenge this is. Maybe let's move to another question, which is an intriguing one from Rosalie Ravago. She asks the panel how you view the rise of cryptocurrencies and how they might help in the development that needs to take place to us achieving net zero. Go on, Harriet.
Well, I think there will be others on the panel who are probably more expert in this. I wouldn't touch them with, the Bitcoin one with the barge pole on the basis that it does use so much energy to generate and to mine. And that's why, I welcome the fact that the Bank of England is looking into creating something that presumably will be much more aligned to what we're all trying to achieve. But it strikes me that it's now becoming more widely known just how, energy hungry Bitcoin is. And perhaps that's one of the things that's been behind its recent correction.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, that's a very, very important, very, very serious point that you've made there, Harriet. Thank you. I wonder, Ben, if I can engage you perhaps in this next bit of discussion, because it's wide and it's touched on something you mentioned, which is the whole question of economy-wide carbon pricing. David Waltham has submitted a question, which is interesting, which is, how do we prevent the impact of the cost of all this on the people least able to pay for it? So there's an economy-wide question for you. I wonder if you'd like to have a bit of a crack at that. Economy-wide carbon pricing, yes, but inevitably it puts pressure on some sectors of the economy, and the least well off in society often end up bearing the pain of that.
Yeah, really, really good question. I think we need to think collectively about how we manage the transition and its impacts on different bits of society. And that's why the work that Onward has been doing is so important, right? Because this is a massive transformation of the global economy. It's changing the economic geography of countries. There are going to be some sectors that by definition lose out, and that's going to have implications for unemployment for communities. And that's how have governments dealt with this successfully in the past? We don't have a particularly great track record. You could look at the transformation in the UK with the coal industry, coal mining, right? 100-year phase-out period. We had 100 years, not that anyone had a predefined date, and we had very significant periods of industrial dislocation and strife. So you're trying to do a very similar thing over a much shorter period of time for every industry on the planet. So this is going to require an awful lot of considered action from government, but also, and in my remarks, I guess, it's also about companies, it's also about financial institutions leaning into that and supporting those issues and helping communities deal with them. The other thing about an economy-wide carbon price, and this kind of links back to the first question, actually, which I would answer in quite a different way. Yeah, how do we mobilize private finance for CCUS? Well, it's about cash flows. It's the price signal. How do we create the price signal? And does a price signal exist for CCUS at the moment? The answer is no, not really. It doesn't. You wouldn't raise funds to deploy capital into that, really, not at the scale that's required. And so the role of government is to create those price signals. And at the beginning, it might not be an economy-wide carbon price. It might be CFDs or something else. But in the future, what we need, and this is why it's really important that the UK has retained its emissions trading scheme and has committed to it becoming a net zero aligned emissions trading scheme, is that market mechanism can actually create the cash flows, create the price signals that can motivate investment in the future. And that's really, really very important.
If I can,
come on in. Yeah,
I would echo the comment about the carbon-wide pricing, because I think it does send those economic signals which Ben was talking about. And ultimately, what we want is the person or the persons who can create the decarbonisation and the alternatives the most efficiently. We really want those to go ahead, because there is an element here. I think this is really important. One size doesn't fit all. There are sectors of the economy which can decarbonize more easily, more cheaply than other sectors. By sending these economic signals, then I think it allows he who can do this most efficiently to do so. And then the second point I would make about the nature of the transition is that, and I think this is envisaged in Paris, it's envisaged under the UN sustainability goals. Not all countries are going to follow exactly the same path. So not all companies would follow the same path. Not all countries will follow the same path. And I think it's very important that the developed markets, and that would be part of our strategy, to take those developed markets into, for instance, electrification more quickly than some of the emerging markets. In the emerging markets, we may see the use of natural gas, for instance, as an alternative to coal. So just to recognize that different companies, different countries are on different trajectories.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And I think, one of the key questions we're trying to address today is, which countries have best practice? So, actually, Guy would say straight away that the UK is a world leader in this area.
And it is.
I'm not disputing that. But I think it's also important to look round at economies that are structured in a different way from an advanced industrial nation and how they're going to approach it, and best practice in emerging economies or even underdeveloped economies. That's a big challenge all of itself. Alan, I was going to come to you with a question that we've had from Angus Bouvier. Because you touched on the issue of the taxonomy, and he's asking whether the UK should be setting its own taxonomy, a definition of ESG, now we've left the EU, or should we be seeking to align with the definitions that the EU is using?
I think it looks like the minister's coming in as well.
Yeah, I'll come to you, Guy.
So I would say, generally business prefers something more standardized. That generally, where there are differences, that makes it harder to operate in an international sphere. Now, I'm not commenting on who should follow who, but I think, learning from each other, cooperating with each other is certainly to be encouraged. And then I think, when we come to the EU taxonomy, I would just make the point about, because I think the question had something around, brown in there as well. It all comes to this sense, which the minister particularly spoke about, of recognizing the role of companies in transition and the recognizing the technologies and the energies which are in transition. Now, those have to be very transparently laid out. We have to ensure that people are committing to a trajectory and delivering on that trajectory, hence all the disclosure, all the sort of data that people have been talking about today. But I think, just having a very narrow definition, is a problem, because, of this sort of binary world that it creates. So having a sense of what is necessary to create the transition realistically, feasibly, economically, I think is important. And I think the UK can take a lead on that.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And I think Guy was coming in on this.
Sure. I mean, this is not a simple question to answer, because it is quite clear that the EU is going down one route. The UK is developing its particular processes, and frankly, we are ahead of the EU in terms of the development of our legislation and our TCFD, ESG, and so many other things. And to be fair, the US is doing other stuff, and the developing world is another kettle of fish altogether. So it would be naive to say that there is just one system that we can all get round. Now, that having been said, if we were having this conversation in 5 to 10 years' time, will there be one system around which everybody is trying to work? Yes, I believe that is the case. But I still believe that there is both the requirement and the need for everybody to make their case at the present stage. And we would disagree with some of the things that some other countries are doing, but at the same stage, we're all working together for a common goal. Others are going at different speeds. So, we happen to be the first country to introduce TCFD. Others haven't embraced that for whatever reason they want to do that. So I think it is a journey to try and get a standardized set of systems that stop greenwashing take place, but allow also for the proper understanding of the data and granular ways going forward. So I would caution about saying you've got to match up straight away with the EU, who haven't even come up with their final version yet. So let's just see where we are. The second thing I just want to touch briefly on a previous question, which is the role of the state. So, there is stuff that we can do. You look at the massive investment in creating a sort of net zero economy in Teesside, and you look at the way in which they've taken the old Redcar site, which is obviously a groundbreaking steel site from years and years and years and generations. And that is now being turned into a net zero economy in a way that is genuinely transformational. You look at the work being done on hydrogen. The all-party group for hydrogen in the House of Commons is run not by some metropolitan London-based MP. It's run by a Red Wall MP based in the heart of Yorkshire. This is a very different world we're living in, and our sell is going to have to be, to touch on the point that Ben was making on coal and the transition, our sell has to be that the future is actually green jobs, which is why, yes, of course, we've got to make the case for climate change, which is a constant case. Yes, of course, we need to change the rules to make it right so that we invest in the right way and a climate change friendly way, which is what government is doing, to be fair. But we've also got to sell that the future is there if we are first in the market for all the green jobs and the green technology that we want to be first in market of. And that, to my mind, is the way in which we convince the Red Wall and other parts of the country, whether they voted Conservative or otherwise, that actually the future is a climate change friendly economy that is creating jobs. That is the way we've got to do. It's not an easy job, but we've got to do it.
Yeah, Guy, and I'm glad you said that. I mean, obviously, as MP for Hexham, you're well north, and whilst I will never define Hexham as a Red Wall seat. The reality is, as Onward's research shows, that the Red Wall constituencies are the most directly affected by our commitment to move to net zero. Most of the London constituencies are very little affected, with the exception perhaps of those close to Heathrow. So actually, there really is an imperative for those areas to be part of the change of the green skilling and the green technologies, if in fact we're going to address that other part of a question we had earlier, which is the disproportionate social impact of the route we've decided to move the country along. Now, we've got a couple of questions here from Freya Benocchi. I'm going to try and sort of link them together because they are wider questions to anyone on the panel. Freya's asking whether we can extend the conversation on emissions outside of carbon to expand into other greenhouse gases such as methane, and also whether anyone has a view about the disproportionate effect of carbon offsetting efforts such as tree planting. That's a completely different subject area. Anyone like to come in on that?
So I have a feeling methane comes to me. So, we absolutely need to include methane, and we do include methane, and the industry generally is very sensitive to methane. I mean, methane, unburnt natural gas, has a real potency as a greenhouse gas, and therefore very important that we deal with it. And, I think most companies, I can talk to BP, are focused very significantly. So we said by 2023, at our major sites, we will have measurement in place. And the important things about measurement is it will allow us to know exactly what is being leaked from our system. We committed to having a sort of a level of 0.20%, fugitive emissions of methane. That's important. And by measuring it, we'll be able to understand. We then said we will commit to a 50% reduction thereafter. So this is important, and I think people are on it. We're also, thinking about, not flaring. Now, flaring is mostly burnt gas, but it has some methane in it. And people say, why would you stop flaring? I mean, the answer is it's bad for the environment, but actually, why set fire to a commodity which you can sell to somebody else and use? So the sort of the value and the environmental come together. So I think sort of emissions are very important. Then I think on the question of offsets, I mean, this is a real complex situation because there are so many different forms of offset. There are the avoided emissions, there are the sort of captured emissions, there are a number of things. I think the key here is that we need to have something which is well understood, of real quality, auditable standard quality, so that people can be confident that these offsetting measures are doing what they're meant to do. Now, I think the other question is the extent to which offset should be the first resort or the last resort. So again, just to talk BP, we've said our emissions reductions do not rely on offsets to 2030. We're looking for where we can manage our portfolio, where we can take specific interventions to cut emissions, and offsets might be in addition. So by the time we get to 2050 and we're into the really hard to abate stuff, that's, I think, when offsets may come in. But the key here is that we sort of make sure that they do what they're intended to do, that they genuinely cut emissions, and therefore the sort of quality control is very important here. But I have to say, offsets absolutely have a part to play. We can't decarbonize everything. So offsets or direct air capture, and this is where new technologies will come in and costs will drop. They're a very important part of the solution, just one we're not relying on at the moment.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I'm glad you came in and answered that question. Well placed to do that. And obviously, the other big industry that's very much caught up by the question of methane is agriculture. Huge challenge for agriculture. And we don't have anyone representing that industry, but having worked in it, I feel, this is where a really technological change becomes crucial if we're going to address methane. Would any of the other members of the panel like to come in either aspect of that question? Yes, Guy.
So I'm speaking as someone who has the largest agricultural and forestry constituency in the whole of England, with more forests than pretty much everyone put together. I definitely feel able to comment. So I'd make 2 points. If you put forward a case that beef farming and dairy farming are bad fundamentally, then you will lose the goodwill of the British people who are attempting to journey towards getting to net zero. Now, the way to do it is to try and talk about effectively good methane and bad methane, and good farming and bad farming. And that, I think, is what DEFRA is trying to do. And that is, I think, the right way forward. Clearly, there are separate issues on methane in terms of the sort of producers by the likes of BP, Shell, whatever. On forestry, so clearly we need more forestry. I don't have any doubt whatsoever. I think Zach Goldsmith and William Worsley are doing a brilliant job. If you haven't read the National Tree Strategy and the forthcoming publication of what they're doing on forestry, then you should really get to know that. But in terms of offsetting, I urge you to read Bill Gates's recent book on how we fix the climate change disaster, because he talks very eloquently on offsetting, and it is absolutely something that we need to have as part of this. And there's no question that as we go forward, offsetting is something that is going to be a key part of what we do and how we run the economy and how individual businesses approach their journey from being this type of business to that type of business. And offsetting will play a part. And we should be encouraging that, supporting that. No question whatsoever.
What occurs to me listening to that, Guy, is that when I was Secretary of State at DEFRA, we had something called the waste hierarchy, and it prioritizes how you deal with waste. You know, the best possible way of dealing with waste is not to create it in the first place. And that's at the top of the hierarchy, right the way back. Worst case scenario, you may have to incinerate it to create energy. But actually, that's a form of prioritizing, which gets quite close to what Alan was talking about. And I think the same, maybe something parallel where where offsetting fits into that hierarchy. Now,
yeah.
We've got one more question here. Now, none of you are in the insurance industry, but Harriet might come to you from a Treasury Select Committee point of view. Jim Clark is asking how the insurance industry can best be involved in improving decarbonisation, climate adaptation, and society's resilience, so we can manage the risks of transition. And that's quite a broad question, Ben, so I might come to you after that.
Yeah, it's such an important question, actually, Dame Caroline, and also such an important question for the UK because we are such a leader in insurance. And I do think the Solvency II review gives an opportunity for regulators to reflect the fact that, you know, climate change is an enormous risk. Insurers are underwriting large parts of that risk. And you will remember from your days as Secretary of State how important it was to set up Flood Re to enable our constituents to be able to get flood insurance, for example. So I think that the insurance industry is going to be one of the most important mechanisms because it will be able to price the risk of moving in the right direction and compare that to the risk of not doing the right thing. And it will be able to really reflect that in the cost of doing business. And so the insurance industry is incredibly important. And obviously, the more that they are underwriting things that are not adapting to net zero, the more expensive insurance premiums are going to be, and the more the capital requirements are going to be for that industry. So it's going to be such an important marketplace for helping us price these risks correctly.
Completely agree with that. Ben, would you like to come in on this?
Sure, no, really important question. I mean, I think building on what Harriet said, you know, insurers are, of course, massive asset owners, and they have a really important role in providing the capital that's required for the transition. So that's one way in which they can help. I think another way in which they can help is, of course, in their significant risk pricing and risk measurement capabilities, and how we work with the insurance industry to integrate that expertise into other bits of the financial services sector. And that's really important. And then finally, in terms of ensuring that there is insurance available for people that need it, and communities that need it, and businesses that need it. And some of that's going to be done together with governments internationally, and is particularly important for developing and emerging economies, and is, I know, a big part of what the COP presidency is trying to do.
Thank you, Ben. And actually, I must be honest and say that Aviva as a company were one of the strongest proponents at Rio of moving to sustainable financial reporting, making the point absolutely clearly that anyone who wants to invest money needs to be sure they're investing in something that is sustainable. And, you know, back then there was a lot of anxiety around obscured stranded assets that companies would have that didn't have a strategy in place for tackling climate change and moving us to net zero. So I agree with you that I think they are going to be a big player in achieving this change, and obviously one of the big institutional investors that we need to mobilize behind the kind of massive changes to our infrastructure if we're going to meet our net zero target. So folks, there's one more question here that is very timely and topical, and it could be our last question, I think. What does the panel hope the G7 meetings in June will deliver for net zero? Anybody? It's pretty imminent. Anybody got any thoughts on what we expect the world's leading statesman to help? Go on, Guy.
So why don't I go first? So I've been party in a very, very small way to the work that's been done by Alok Sharma and the COP team who are obviously then reporting into the Prime Minister. I suspect that there will be a huge amount of work being done to ensure that the pathway from June's G7 to COP is the right way forward, and bringing an awful lot of key players on board. You can't overstate the development that we saw in China fairly recently, whereby they committed to net zero. You can't overstate the impact of the work with overseas countries, of the key G7 countries, and making sure that there is a degree of harmony. And you can't have a conversation about taxonomy and other things without getting the big players together and deciding what is the right way forward. The interesting thing is that everybody agrees that TCFD is the next key step, and the UK is the first to have done that.
Yeah, there's no question about we put ourselves in the frame this year with the huge international gatherings, and there has to be a pathway from one to the other. Anybody else like to come in on G7 at all? No, we'll take it. I see that one more quick question's popped up here. I'm trying to think how to summarize it quickly, but how upfront does government need to be in selling the need for our greener economy and lifestyles to the public? There's concern from Kieran Breen there, linked to a previous question, that there's a bit of a green backlash potentially amongst people. That's a good question for politicians. Any of our elected members like to just chip in on that?
I'll have a little bit of a stab at that one, because obviously for a lot of people, the cost of filling their car, the cost of transport, particularly in rural areas, tends to be primarily by car, and the cost of heating, often drafty homes, these are going to be some of the biggest outlays that they have. And so we clearly need to use this as an opportunity to try and reduce those ongoing costs of living for people. And I think that would be something that then brings people with us, because effectively by having a renewable source of heating and source of powering your vehicle, you should over time be able to do that much more cheaply, and we've seen some very dramatic reductions in terms of the cost of generating renewables. So I think focus on how it's going to save people money over a long period of time, and how, although you're investing quite a lot up front, particularly with some of the things like air source heat pumps, it does mean that you basically will get pretty much free heat for a long period of time in the future.
Harriet, that's just what I hoped, a nice common sense, practical, political response. And in the remaining couple of minutes that I have, just to conclude this webinar, just want to really thank the panelists, and perhaps end just with a little story. I'm sure you all tune into today's programme in the morning, and you'll probably see that sometimes the debate about net zero seems to bottom out with listeners' queries about what they should do with their boiler. And actually, that's the reality, that for a lot of people who are not specialists in this subject, they really need to know what it means for them. But I had a wonderful, heartwarming example in my own constituency of where our local authority actually changed the entire heating system for all the tower blocks on one of the largest council estates in Western Europe. And one of the consequences of putting in triple glazing, putting solar panels on the roof, putting in thermostats on radiators and fueling the whole lot with wood chip boilers, was that the energy bill for the residents halved. And I think that what that does demonstrate is there are real practical good outcomes that can be achieved with all the actors, and you represent them, working together to this very important commitment that we have to get to net zero. So thank you so much, all of you, for what you've said today. Really, really interesting. Onward, we're very grateful, because that will help them with their ongoing research, and really gets our whole series of webinars off to an